So let's talk about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the chemical process by which plants, algae, and photosynthetic bacteria use light energy to drive the synthesis of organic compounds. In plants, algae, and certain types of bacteria, the photosynthetic process results in the release of molecular oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that is used to synthesize carbohydrates. This is called oxygenic photosynthesis. Why is photosynthesis so important? It is important because photosynthesis provides the energy and reduced carbon required for the survival of virtually all life on our planet, as well as the molecular oxygen necessary for the survival of oxygen-consuming organisms such as you and me. Plants are the primary producers of energy in an ecosystem, and that's in all ecosystems. And so what you see here is you see a typical energy pyramid. At the bottom, you see producers, and they make up 65% of the abundance of life on the planet. 20% primary consumers, 10% secondary, and 5% tertiary. On the outside here, we see decomposers. But if you don't have a strong producer base, then you will not have an ecosystem that is flourishing. And if you don't have an ecosystem that's flourishing, then you're going to have a limited number of organisms. Photosynthesis is important because that's the process that these producers use to capture sunlight energy so it can be available to the consumers to utilize. Therefore, the trophic level most important to the maintenance of an ecosystem is plants, the producers. So, why do producers make up the greatest organismal abundance on the energy pyramid? So, as I alluded to before, producers make up 65% of the food pyramid. Therefore, they are the most abundant organisms on the planet. But only 1% of the sun's energy is actually converted by photosynthesis to chemical energy by plants. And so what ends up happening is in order for all of the organisms on the food pyramid that are above it to be supported, we need to have a lot of plants being able to capture as much sunlight energy as absolutely possible, thus making them the most abundant organism. So recalling from the energy unit how much energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, the answer is 10%. So that's why we call that the law of 10%. Remember, it's 10% and then 10% of 10% and 10% of 10%, etc., as we move up the energy pyramid. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time now talking about plant anatomy. All right, there are two primary types of leaves. On the left here, you see a simple leaf. On the right, a compound leaf. Now, the big thing that separates the two is that in a compound leaf, you can see here in the simple leaf, you have one petiole right here and a single blade that is attached. On a compound leaf, the big difference is this. You have a petiole, right, that's right here, but then you have a bunch of leaflets, multiple blades, that come off of an individual petiole. And usually those are joined by something called a petiolule. And so what you end up with is just a leaf that is more complex and therefore referred to as a compound leaf. Again, simple leaf, one petiole, one blade. All right, so here's a few just basic definitions regarding simple and compound leaves. First of all, what a leaf is. A leaf is the primary tool of the plant. It gathers the sun's energy for photosynthesis. Compound leaf, like we just talked about in the previous slide, compound leaves have multiple leaflets, and so what ends up happening is those things attach to the petioles, and they attach by something called the rachis. And from there, what we also have are those little petiolules that come off. Specifically, a petiole is the stalk of a leaf that attaches to the stem. A rachis is the primary stem-like structure onto which the other parts attach. You've probably heard of this term before, but the idea of a bud, we see a lot of these in the spring. Hopefully we'll see them sooner than later in the next few months. This is the part of the anatomy from which the stem will quote-unquote shoot. What does that mean? All of the plant material, the petioles, the root sheaths, etc., will all stem from the axillary bud. What does this do? It allows the plant to transport materials up and down the plant, which we'll talk about a little more when we get into the internal structure of a leaf. And lastly, this idea of a blade. The blade is the area where the plant is going to contain the majority of its chlorophyll. And so the big idea here is we want to provide a surface so that the plant can absorb the sunlight energy so we can do photosynthesis. So you see different definitions. All right, let's explore the internal structures of a leaf. Here you see the internal structure of a leaf. On the right-hand side and across the bottom, you see the various different structures that make up the internal structure of a leaf. We're going to go through individually each of these and provide definitions and give you some examples of where you might see them. All right, let's start with the cuticle right here and right here. So we have cuticle on the top and the bottom. And what it is it is a thin wax coating on the upper epidermis, and it helps protect against excessive water loss, mechanical injury, and fungal attack. Next, we find the upper epidermis here. Epidermis, just like with your skin, refers to a covering or a lining. And so what the upper epidermis here does is it aids the cuticle in its function, namely it assists in protecting against water loss, mechanical injury, and fungal attack. And underneath the upper epidermis, we find palisade mesophyll cells. Specifically, the palisade mesophyll cells make up the bulk of the tissue you see in a leaf. And the big thing that we have with the palisade mesophyll cells is the chloroplasts are here, and so is the chlorophyll. And the big thing that happens here is we carry on the actual process of photosynthesis. And below the palisade mesophyll cells, and more towards the inferior bottom portion of the leaf, we find down here spongy mesophyll cells. The spongy mesophyll cells are located below the palisade. And the big thing that happens here is we have an exchange and circulation of gases and water vapor that occurs. There is some photosynthetic function, but again, mostly we're going to talk about exchange of gases and water. All right, and now here's a big one. Embedded within leaves, they have veins. And those veins contain the leaves' conducting materials, meaning the xylem and the phloem. What do? They carry water and glucose to the other parts of the plant. Now, specifically xylem, what it does is it's located inside the veins and it carries water and minerals to the leaf. And what I think about with xylem is I think about that's how things go upward. So in order for water and minerals to obtain entry into a plant, they have to be absorbed through the roots. This is different from the phloem. Phloem carries food and glucose that's made in the leaves down the plant so that it can be utilized for storage and for basic life processes. So when I think about xylem, again, the products go upward and the phloem means they go down. Now, sometimes what I'll use with phloem is the fact that it starts with a P, right? And if you think about the things that are made in photosynthesis, anytime we make something, we call it a product. So products of photosynthesis, both words starting with a P, that would be the glucose, right? Then that makes sense that it would be the phloem that would transport it down the plant. Plastids. Plastids control the color of the leaves. Plastids with green chlorophyll appear green. Otherwise, we can also have others which are red and yellow. We could call those chromoplasts. All right, now let's talk about sheath cells. What sheath cells are, they are thin, thick-walled plant cells, and they surround the veins. And what their job is to do is they support the transportation ability of the xylem and the phloem. You can see the bundle of sheath cells right here. They're demonstrated in pink. Then there is the lower epidermis here. Like the upper epidermis, it aids the cuticle in its function, assisting in protecting against water loss, mechanical injury, and fungal attack. And here's a pretty important one. Stoma. what stoma is we talked about how on the inferior portion or the underside of a leaf is where most of the gas exchange occurs for plants in the process of photosynthesis. And stoma is provides the tiny openings in the lower epidermis for this exchange of gas and water to occur. So what ends up happening is you end up having the stoma open during periods of high moisture, but then they'll also close in periods or times where there's drought or where there is not significant moisture. And lastly, there are guard cells. Kind of means what it says what it meant. Guard cells do just that. They regulate the opening and closing of the stoma, and so they guard that process and make sure that the plant is open when there is heavy content of moisture in the air and closes when it's not. All right, and very briefly, let's talk a little bit about the photosynthetic equation. First, what is important for photosynthesis? In other words, what do plants require? Well, they require three things in order to do the process. There's got to be carbon dioxide, there must be water, and there must be sunlight. And what do plants produce? Well, pretty important substance to us as human beings. They produce oxygen. Which brings us to the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis, which can be summarized as follows. We take 6 carbon dioxide molecules. We combine that with 6 water molecules, and we really should have also sunlight energy included here. So it should say plus sunlight energy. And what are we going to make? Well, we're going to make C6H12O6, and we're also going to make 6 O2s, 6 oxygen. So we're going to make glucose and oxygen. All right, and I have one more question for you. So this is a seed. This is a grown tree. My question to you is this. So my question is this. Where does the biomass, meaning the trunk, the bark, the limbs, the leaves, etc. of a tree, come from? It started out as a little seed, right? So where did all that stuff come from?